If the New Orleans Saints elect or are unable to go with an offensive tackle in the first round, this surprise position actually makes a ton of sense. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, I'm going to give you 3 of the biggest takeaways from Mickey Loomis's pre-draft presser, including just how comfortable the New Orleans Saints really feel at pick number 14 overall in the first round. We're also going to take a look at why you shouldn't be at all surprised by a cornerback investment in this year's draft class, but another defensive back position that might end up being a bit of a surprise selection for New Orleans earlier rather than later. And we're going to kick everything off with my biggest surprise projection for the New Orleans Saints in the first round. If the offensive tackles that the Saints want aren't there, or if they decide to wait on that position, defensive interior might be the spot that makes the most sense for them to address at number 14 overall. We got all that and much more coming up for you on today's episode. We appreciate you very much for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day, and for being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by friends at Monopoly Go. Listen, I've got a little bit of a competitive side, and it's a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist to the classic Monopoly. So join your friends and family and download Monopoly Go for free on the App Store or Google Play. I think that defensive tackle could still be a surprise selection for the New Orleans Saints in the first round, assuming that either all of the top offensive tackles are off the board, or if the New Orleans Saints decide that they feel like they can address that in the second round instead. I do this every year before we walk into the NFL draft. What's the biggest surprise selection that could potentially happen for the New Orleans Saints? And I think in the first round, the biggest surprise selection for New Orleans could be defensive interior. I'll even expand that out to defensive line. Now, let me be really clear on what I'm saying here. I think that the New Orleans Saints should take an offensive tackle in the first round, particularly a guy like Taliese Fuaga or J.C. Latham out of Alabama. Taliese Fuaga, of course, of Oregon State, to help them out at that right tackle position, especially with all of the big question marks centering around Ryan Ramczyk right now and the future that he may or may not have with the New Orleans Saints. And that's all fine and dandy. And I think the New Orleans Saints will target an offensive tackle. They know that that's a big need for them going into this year's draft. But sometimes teams don't draft early on based on need. This is a deep offensive tackle class. Mickey Loomis said that himself during his pre-draft presser, said that most anybody would tell you that the offensive line class is very deep in this one. So if that's the case, maybe New Orleans feels comfortable waiting until 45 or trading up from 45 to address their offensive tackle. Sorry, I think I might have said defensive tackle a second ago, but offensive tackle spot because of how deep the class is. If that ends up being the case, then I could absolutely see the Saints addressing their defensive line. Defensive ends like Latu out of UCLA and Jared Verse out of Florida State are absolutely a part of that conversation. Potentially a falling Dallas Turner could be in that mold as well, or in that number as well. Defensive interior guys like Byron Murphy, who's probably going to be a top 10 selection. Seems to be the way that that's trending. A lot of people really like Byron Murphy landing now with the defensive tackle out of Texas, landing now with the Chicago Bears at 9 tends to be a pretty common spot for him to go now. But a Johnny Newton out of Illinois could absolutely be a guy that the New Orleans Saints surprise by selecting at number 14 overall. Now, you might say that, hey, if the Saints are going to draft a defensive tackle or an edge rusher in the first round, then maybe trading down might make the most sense for them, but that might not be the way that they look at it based on the way that they look at trading down. If they are going to feel comfortable taking an edge rusher or a defensive tackle at 14, they're comfortable taking that player at 14. That's typically the case. Now, I think offensive tackle is the must. I think offensive tackle is the right choice. I think offensive tackle is the need. But we know the New Orleans Saints tend to surprise sometimes in the first round. So if they're going to surprise in the first round, the defensive line, particularly defensive interior for me, but I can make the argument for edge rusher, seems to be the place where the biggest surprise could be in store. So why the emphasis on defensive tackle? Why is that a spot that I could see the New Orleans Saints going after and making a decision to maybe, curb all of the expectations and end up selecting? Well, first of all, I think that a big part of it is that defensive line is still the lifeblood of the defense, which is the stronger, or has, I don't want to say stronger, let's say the greater emphasis for the New Orleans Saints over the course of the past few years, especially since the defense became a very strong unit. And effectively, with Dennis Allen taking over as a head coach, as a defensive coach, makes sense that you'd put some emphasis into your defense, right? And one of the places where the Saints were weakest last year was on their defensive line, both in the pass rush, getting moved off the line of scrimmage in the run game, not necessarily taking the steps forward as a run defense that they expected to take going into 2023. All of those things point to, if the Saints were going to address something early on the defensive side of the football, that it would be on the defensive line. This team likes to build within the trenches. They like to stick with their prototypes, all those other things. And Johnny Newton, or Jerzon Newton out of Illinois, is a guy that can kind of help you in all of those different areas, check the boxes of building your interior, help you out in your run defense, be a guy that's stout in the run game, that can kind of come in and replace and maybe even improve upon some of the production that you got from Malcolm Roach in the run game last year, while also giving you somebody that can be disruptive on the interior next to Bryan Bresee, last year's first round pick. Now, I understand. I get it. Defensive tackle is not a premium position. It's not a prime position. It's not a premier position, however it is that you want to look at it. But that hasn't stopped the New Orleans Saints before for investing round one picks, or even just overall top 100 selections on defensive tackles. They tend to lean into that area when there's a prospect that makes sense for them. They did it with Sheldon Rankins, did it with Bryan Bresee. They could do it again here when it comes to Johnny Newton. Now, if the Saints go about that, then they would need to make sure that they're able to address offensive tackle probably as early as the second round. Kingsley Suamataia coming out of BYU is a guy that could potentially plug in at right tackle. Kieran Amagaji out of Yale could be a guy that could plug in at right tackle as well. If a falling Tyler Guyton finds his way into the second round out of Oklahoma, maybe there's a chance to trade up into the earlier portion of the second round to grab that player, so on and so forth. So there's lots of opportunities still for this team to address their offensive line. And then depending upon how they feel about guys like Javon Foster out of Missouri, or Christian Jones out of Texas, or Walter Rouse out of Oklahoma, then they might be able to even address those positions later on in the draft as well. Now, it would be ill-suited, it would be ill-advised for them to do that. Especially picking at 14, you have a real opportunity to get one of the big guys. Olu Fashanu out of Penn State, Taliese Fuaga coming out of Oregon State, J.C. Latham out of Alabama, Troy Fautanu out of Washington. They're really, really good offensive linemen, of which some collection of those four players should be available at 14. And there's a real opportunity for you to be able to draft any one of those guys and get somebody that can start for you right away as a plug-and-play starter at either tackle spot. And then in Fautanu's case, Fuaga's case, or Latham's case, from what I've understood from some NFL teams, could all play on the interior as well. Fautanu probably gets a little bit more of that conversation than the other guys who are 6'5" plus. But in any case, you have the opportunity to be able to get people that are versatile and can move around. Fashanu, probably more of a pure left tackle for you. It doesn't really aid your right tackle spot, but opens up your opportunities in terms of what you might be able to ask Trevor Penning to do if Ryan Ramczyk is, as we expect, not going to be ready to go at the beginning of the season. So I think that would be my biggest surprise in the first round. That wouldn't be super surprising, is that the Saints still end up investing in the trenches, but maybe look over to the defensive side. So we'll see if that's right. I think offensive line is the right call. I think offensive line is the better call. But if the Saints were going to surprise in the first round, defensive line is certainly where I could see them doing that. Let's take a look at where a surprise might come down in the second round, as well as, of course, why you shouldn't be at all surprised if the New Orleans Saints decide to put down a pretty sizable cornerback investment in this year's draft class. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, patience. The formula that ends up bringing you a winning trophy is also the one that helps to keep your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything that you need to keep your number one ride or die running at peak performance. If you're looking for things like superchargers, roof racks, LED headlights, exhaust kits, you're going to be able to find all of it over at ebaymotors.com. With over 122 parts and accessories for your number one ride or die, you're always going to be able to find what it is that you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit the first time, every time, or your money back. Because with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, you're burning rubber, not cash. With eBay Motors, you are able to find every part that you need at the price that you want. And it's even easier now to make your MVP bring home those huge wins. Head over today to keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit eligible only to U.S. customers. All right, family. If the New Orleans Saints are going to make a big investment at cornerback, you should not be surprised, nor should you think that it has anything at all to do with the future of Marshon Lattimore, at least not the short-term future. We appreciate you very much, as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. If you're getting a little tired of having to turn your TV down all the time from those other sports networks because of all the shouting, make sure you make that switch over to Locked On Sports Today. It's a 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube that's all sports all the time, programmed for you to make sure that you get all the biggest stories from around the world of sports without all the screaming. So go check it out today. That is Locked On Sports Today. You can find it for free on YouTube and also on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I don't think that you should be surprised at all if you see the New Orleans Saints make any kind of hefty investment at the cornerback spot in this year's NFL draft. And I don't think that if the New Orleans Saints do, that it signals anything at all about Marshon Lattimore. We're going to get to Mickey Loomis's comments or loose comments around Marshon Lattimore in a little bit, because pretty big takeaways there as we take a look at Mickey Loomis's pressers and the three big takeaways from that. But it seems pretty clear that the Saints are at least expecting at this time for Marshon Lattimore to be on the team in 2024. But if you really think about it, you've got a couple of practice squad guys, and then you've got Marshon Lattimore, Alontae Taylor, and Paulson Adebo, and that's effectively it. You got a couple of practice squad / special teams guys, right? That's effectively it, right? From a pure numbers standpoint, since only have 5 cornerbacks on their roster right now, and then Ugo Amadi has the versatility to play in the slot. Okay, so we can call it 5.5, right? Because Ugo Amadi's probably more of a career safety, I think is safe to say. So if the Saints end up investing in a cornerback in this year's draft, I could see them trading up for a cornerback from the 5th round, some of those 5th round selections to move up to get a Jarvis Brownlee out of Louisville, who I think would be a good fit, right? Good size at 5'11", 200 plus pounds, really, really good physical press man corner as well. They can move up for a Khyree Jackson, who out of Oregon, who checks all the same boxes as a Brownlee, but is even bigger. I think he's like 6'2", 6'3" during his time over the course of the draft process. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here for the Saints to make the kind of move that they feel that they need to make to go ahead and continue to build up their cornerback room. But I don't think that them doing so really tells you anything about the future of Marshon Lattimore. As of right now, the expectation is that Marshon Lattimore is going to be on the roster in 2023. Now that changes when it changes, and that's about it. Earlier this offseason, we saw the Saints bring in a 5'9" potential slot corner for a visit, and everybody said, oh, that must mean they're trading Marshon Lattimore. Those two things could not have been more disconnected from one another. They didn't even sign that player. So now, when it comes to the NFL draft, it seems reasonable that people would draw those correlations as well, but not necessarily do you see all the time correlation and causation really taking place in these situations. You will make that decision because you want another young corner on your roster. You've got 2 corners that might not be here next year, right? All these question marks that have been circulating around Marshon Lattimore. If he plays through 2024, what's the conversation look like ahead of 2025? Paulson Adebo's on a contract year. What does his future look like with the team? Do they end up getting him extended? He could be one of those post-week 1 extensions, like what we've seen with Marshon Lattimore himself, Demario Davis. We saw it with Carl Granderson as well after the Green Bay Packers game last year. So we saw that kind of, creep up a little bit closer to the beginning or a little bit further down the beginning of the calendar. We can certainly see things like that happen with a Paulson Adebo as well. So, but in any case, you still want to make sure that you have more investments at your cornerback spot, especially when you look at this coaching staff, which is littered with with coaches that are secondary guys. Dennis Allen, secondary guy. Marcus Robertson, the defensive backs coach, of course, a secondary guy. Joe Woods, defensive coordinator, secondary guy. This is what they do. They invest in the back end. They invest in their coverage. They invest in their secondary. That's one of the reasons why the team has been strong in that area. Secondary was the strongest position group on this team last year, in my humble opinion. Even having to navigate the injuries that they had to navigate. So I could absolutely see the Saints making an investment at corner. So guys that can play on the outside in the perimeter to give you some more depth there, like a Jarvis Brownlee, like a Khyree Jackson, those guys make sense. How about a Chris Adams-Drain out of Missouri? Yeah, he's smaller, but the Saints have no problem with Ugo Amadi backing up Alontae Taylor in the slot, despite him coming in at a smaller stature. They, visited with that corner before the beginning of the season. Was it Maddox? They brought in for a visit. He was smaller. They ended up not signing him, but I think that had a lot to do with the fact that he's played 7 games in the last 2 seasons or something like that. So you get a guy like Chris Adams-Drain who comes in undersized, but you're playing him in the slot, so you're comfortable with that. And he's a really, really talented slot corner. He's a guy that could get that done for you. So I can see the Saints going that route as well. So perimeter corner or slot corner, I see being big time in play for the New Orleans Saints. And I think either one of those addresses your perimeter concerns if you're concerned at all about what your cornerback tandem looks like going into 2025. If Paulson Adebo doesn't get an extension and decides that he wants to test the market and potentially goes and signs somewhere else, then you move Alontae Taylor to the outside, and then bang, you have Chris Adams-Drain because you drafted him. So you've addressed your perimeter and you've addressed your slot cornerback spot for 2025 with one selection in 2024. Similarly, same thing. Paulson Adebo gets an extension, but the New Orleans Saints and Marshon Lattimore stick together for 2024, but decide to split for 2025. Alontae Taylor bounces back outside where he plays his best ball. Chris Adams-Drain plugs into the slot. Or you really like where Alontae Taylor is trending when it comes to the slot. Either one of those other 2 perimeter guys goes away. You've got a Jarvis Brownlee or you've got a Khyree Jackson to fall back on. You see what I'm saying here? So I think there are some of these selections that are going to happen post round 2 that are going to be potential trade ups, which show you that the team is targeting that player, that I think will say, oh, that must mean that the Saints plan to trade away Marshon Lattimore immediately, and that might not be the case. They might just be getting ready for 2025 post Paulson Adebo, or a potential split for the Saints and Marshon Lattimore, which hopefully we don't see going into 2025. There's lots of ways to look at this. You can address this position now, and you can address this position to make sure you have what you need later in terms of starting capability, or at least starting options, replacement options. And this year you end up building up your depth. The surprise pick at 14 for me is a safety. Tyler Nubin out of Minnesota, Jaden Hicks out of Washington State. These are the guys that I think you look at and you go, okay, well, is there the opportunity to be able to grab one of those guys and address where you actually do still have a hole, right? Like the Saints still have a hole after Marcus May left, or after they moved on from Marcus May. And I think Jonathan Abram can fill that role. I think Jordan Howden could continue to develop to fill that role, but I like him better as an away from the line of scrimmage post safety, a deep safety, playing kind of Tyrann Mathieu's role. So another year or 2 behind Tyrann Mathieu before taking that role over. Cool with that. So do you get some young competition to compete with a Jonathan Abram, who right now is only on a 1-year deal? And then you can find yourself a guy that could be able to, be your future at that position. You can find that in the 2nd round with a Tyler Nubin. There's guys like Javon Bullock out of Georgia. You've got the young safety out of USC. You can wait a little bit later. If you're looking for a box safety like a Malik Mustafa out of Wake Forest, a Katana Ladapu out of Oregon State, there's a lot of these guys that end up making a lot of sense. But if I'm looking for a surprise at 45, like we looked at a surprise at 14, I think defensive back, but namely safety, is the one that I would be keeping an eye out on. Otherwise, I think that it all depends upon what's selected at 14. If the Saints go offensive line at 14, then they're freed up to make a pick like safety at 45. But if they don't go offensive line at 14, which again would be ill-advised and surprising, I could see them going offensive line at 45, which might be a necessity at that point. So those are my 2 big surprises. And then the one thing that you shouldn't be too surprised about, to see this team continue to invest in its secondary, which has consistently been one of its strongest units over the course of the past few years. All right, coming up next, let's take a look at 3 big takeaways from Mickey Loomis's pre-draft presser, including why they clearly feel very confident about where they're selecting at pick 14. We got that coming up for you as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by your friends at Monopoly Go. Look, we've all been there. It's halftime. Your team is down. Scoreboard's not looking good. You're feeling low. Finally, you start to get to the point where you got to lift your head up, pick up your chin, and say to yourself, you know what? It's time to get back in this game and to pull off some bank heist to make sure that you take as much of your friends' money as possible. Yeah, dude, Monopoly Go is like that. It's so much fun. I play Monopoly Go all the time. I grew up playing Monopoly with my family, and this is just sort of the mobile hit twist to the classic Monopoly that you already know and love. There's even a New Orleans themed board that you can make your way to as well. Jake Madison of Locked On Pelicans and I play all the time as well. So lots of good stuff for you to get in on, tracking your progress, comparing your progress on leaderboards, all of that. And you can play countless dynamic versions of classic Monopoly boards, all of that. So go and check it out today. It is Monopoly Go, which you can find on the App Store and Google Play. So get back out there, put your game face on, and download Monopoly Go now for free on the App Store and Google Play. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints feel very comfortable at where they're selecting at 14 and feel they're going to be able to get an impact player immediately at that selection. That and more takeaways from Mickey Loomis's pre-draft press conference from Tuesday. We appreciate you very much, as always, making us your first listen of the day every day here on the Locked On Saints podcast. Don't forget to go and check out Locked On Pelicans as the Pelicans continue to try to fight their way through that Oklahoma City series in the playoffs. A heartbreaking loss to start it off, but can they rebound? No pun intended. Jake Madison has got you all covered over at Locked On Pelicans. And of course, you can go and check out Locked On LSU with Caroline Fenton as well, especially as LSU football gets closer and closer. And New Orleans Saints football is getting closer and closer. And the next big step happens on Thursday, tomorrow, as the NFL draft kicks off. I want to let you know that Locked On NFL Scouting, our guys, Joe Marino and Kyle Krabs, will be live all throughout the first day and second day of the NFL draft. Make sure you're going to check that out. You're going to be able to find it on Locked On NFL Scouting and Locked On NFL. We'll also have stuff coming out for you here on Locked On Saints as selections are made, including interviews, some college experts that will be a part of that and everything as well. So lots of good stuff here to keep you up to date with everything going on for the New Orleans Saints in the NFL draft and the NFL across the NFL draft. If you want to check out Kyle and Joe, a Locked On NFL Scouting, a Locked On NFL as well. So the New Orleans Saints are very comfortable making a selection at 14. It doesn't sound like they're really tempted by the idea of trading up. They don't really have the fodder to trade up either, unless they want to give up their second round pick, which doesn't make much sense, or they're trying to give up future selections, which, might be able to be a little bit more helpful later on in the draft when you're trying to move up to close that gap between the second round pick 45 and the fifth round pick 150. That's really maybe the area where those future picks can be a little bit more valuable for you. But for New Orleans at 14, and we know that trading back's not typically a part of the MO for New Orleans. Picking at 14, Mickey Loomis was asked, do you think that you're going to be able to find a good player? Like, are you comfortable with the level of player that you can find at 14? And he said, yeah, like immediately, yes. Feel that we're going to be able to get a really good player at 14. Paraphrasing is effectively what he said. So that makes perfect sense. And that's the right way to think about this, right? We talked about Penn State's Olu Fashanu. We talked about Taliese Fuaga out of Oregon State. J.C. Latham out of Alabama. Troy Fautanu out of Washington. You can go with a project guy, a little bit more of a developmental guy like Amarius Mims out of Georgia. I would probably stay away from that just because you don't really have the time for development right now. You really need help on your offensive line immediately. And as he said, they feel they can find immediate help. So I think that those other four guys are the ones that really check the boxes about giving you immediate help at some place on your offensive line at either tackle spot. So yeah, I agree. I think that the Saints are going to be able to find an impact player there. And even if somehow or another, all of those offensive tackles come off the board, or the majority of those offensive tackles come off the board, whatever, you still got defensive interior, you still got edge rusher where you could potentially find a difference-making player as well. Sometimes you take the best player on the board, whether it's at a position of need or not. Or look, maybe they shock us all and go with Brock Bowers, the tight end out of Georgia. Like, that's another way that they could go. I maintain that they shouldn't do that just because I don't think that the roster is good enough to take a luxury pick like that. But hey, you do what you got to do. And again, the NFL draft is more than one round. So you could do that, and then you could circle back around in the second round. We actually did a mock draft here on this show not too long ago, a couple weeks ago, where we went Brock Bowers in the first round, and then still were able to address in multiple spots the offensive line later on, second round, fifth round, all that. So it's not the end of the world if that happens. So the Saints should feel really good about where they are at 14. It's one of the things I've been saying about them is that where they select, especially with the emphasis on quarterbacks and wide receivers, you're talking 7 players, like half the board before you even get on the clock is already pretty much taken up by 4 quarterbacks and 3 receivers. That's pretty good. And then outside of that, you've also got a Joe Alt. So that's pick number 8. That's probably off there. You got to expect 1 edge rusher to come off the board before you had either pick number 8, pick number 8 literally with the Atlanta Falcons, or pick number 9 with the Chicago Bears. Real opportunity there that you get to 9 or 10 players and only 1 offensive tackle's off the board at that point. You've got then 4 more offensive tackles that you like, or that you should like at 14, with 4 selections ahead of you at 10, 11, 12, and 13. Pretty good. Like, you'll take that. You'll take that 9 times out of 10. So I agree. I think that the Saints should feel really good about where they are at 14. I think trading back too far takes you out of the position to be able to grab one of those guys that can really help you on the offensive line. I think trading up is just an unnecessary use of assets, and an irresponsible use of assets, unless you're really, really honed in on one guy that you got to go and get. It could happen. But I think, sitting back at 14 just makes a lot of sense for this team. So I liked the fact that Mickey Loomis kind of highlighted that they feel really good about sticking at 14 and taking this selection, should that be what they choose to do. Takeaway number 2 came around with Ryan Ramczyk, right? Asking a little bit about where Ryan Ramczyk's recovery process is. And he didn't really give a lot of information, but the information that he did give was that there's not really been any change since what Dennis Allen updated at the annual meetings. And what he updated at the annual meetings was that things aren't really progressing the way that they had thought. Things aren't really progressing the way that Ryan Ramczyk himself had hoped. As we mentioned, like, we've heard some things, John Hendricks and I over at Saints News Network, about the recovery not going well. Nick Underhill published some stuff as well. Like, there's some intrigue out there in terms of, what is going to be the future of Ryan Ramczyk and the New Orleans Saints. And I got to say, like, right now, things don't look great. The outlook doesn't look fantastic, and it certainly doesn't feel as good as it did in terms of the language that this team is using about that outlook and that situation, as back in February when we were talking to them at the Combine, right? Like, it was a very different tone then. Oh yeah, no, we feel really good about where he's going and things like that. And now all of a sudden that's not the case. And usually health isn't really a smokescreen that people will use for players that are already on the roster. So I think that for New Orleans, there's a real chance here that they're looking for a new starting right tackle, at least to start the season in 2024. And if that's the case, you have the opportunity to do it. You're in the right draft class. You got the right class. You got the right players there to be able to get that done. So just a little bit of an update there. He also updated on Trevor Penning about kind of feeling good about where things are trending with him and the new offense. And, I'm excited. I'll lean more into that, or buy more into that when we see it. Right. Particularly during training camp and stuff like that. But it would be nice to kind of see him maybe fit a little bit more in his element in a run heavy offense. And then finally on the Marshon Lattimore front, right? My last big takeaway here. Mickey was asked straight up, what are you confident as of right now? Does it feel like you're confident that Marshon Lattimore will be on the roster in 2024? And he said yes, very quickly. Kat Terrell with a great follow-up, just kind of asking, like, do you really mean that? Or, is that really the thing? Or, like, is there the chance? And he kind of went on to highlight, like, look, everybody's tradable. But the thing that I thought, and we're going to do a whole episode on this because I thought it was really, really insightful, but it's not, a soundbite thing. It's one of those things that, like, a nerd like me really, really goes for. But, Mickey talked about, like, look, the opportunity to be able to trade a player away or trade for a player is not as abundantly available as it might be made out to seem by media, public, all the other stuff. And we certainly perpetuate that because we talk about, like, oh, this trade, that trade, surprise trades, blah, blah, all this other stuff. It's not like you're on the phone every day working deals and working trades and stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it. Salary cap implications, value in terms of the return. Do you have the replacement for the player? All those things. And I think that a lot of those things are obstacles in terms of trading away Marshon Lattimore. And one of the reasons why, as of right now, obviously things can change. Like you said, everybody's tradable. There's always a price and everything like that. I agree with that. I think that that's right. I think that's true. But I'll say right now on, March 23rd/24th, that I would expect Marshon Lattimore to be on this roster in 2024 because what market? And it's not a market about him. It's about the value that you saw L'Jarius Sneed get traded for, that you saw, Carlton Davis get traded for. It's not worth it. Just simply not worth it. So yeah, that's kind of where I sit on the Marshon Lattimore thing. But it was kind of refreshing to kind of hear that whole explanation that, like, look, trades aren't as abundantly available and there's not as many trade opportunities as some would have you think. And I think that's important context. And one of the reasons why I think Marshon Lattimore right now probably going to be in New Orleans in 2024. Although we'll see. I might be kicking myself for saying it, for phrasing it that way in particular. But you get what I'm getting at when I talk about this. This is all projection and conjecture. All right. Coming up tomorrow, more pre-draft, bold predictions for the draft, letting you know what we're hearing as we get closer and closer to the NFL draft kicking off Thursday night, tomorrow night. So lots of good stuff on the way for all of that. Really appreciate you, as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day. Don't forget to go and check out Locked On Pels, Locked On LSU as well. I appreciate you very much, as always, making Locked On Saints a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.